If you're enjoying haunted UK fiction, please consider supporting the show on Patreon or Ko-fi. Simply search for Haunted UK Podcast. There, stood by the banister and staring down at me with an intensity I found hard to bear, was a man, smartly dressed, with thick black hair and black side whiskers. What I noticed most were his angular features and prominent cheekbones. I stood there, frozen to the spot, and meeting his cold stare for what seemed like an eternity before I was finally able to tear my eyes away, and when I glanced back, only several seconds later, he had gone. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to Haunted UK Fiction, a sister podcast to The Haunted UK, which features original flash fiction, short stories, and novellas with paranormal themes. All stories you will hear were written by a collection of talented writers, authors, and storytellers, both independent and professional. In today's episode, we'll be reading the first of a two-part story called Bleakmore, a Gothic Tale, which was sent in to us by Emma Hudairi. Emma has always had a fascination for ghost stories and supernatural tales, from hiding under the covers as a child reading Aidan Chambers' library books to hiding behind cushions as an adult watching paranormal investigations and listening to podcasts. Bleakmore, a Gothic Tale, is her tribute to some of the great Gothic horror tales of the past, and was written as a birthday gift for her daughter Emily during the first lockdown of the pandemic, a dark and uncertain time where many families found themselves divided by distance with no certainty of when they might be reunited. For Emma, this was a welcome creative release, and for her daughter, it was a great surprise and a personal connection despite the miles. Though the places in the story are entirely made up, they are based on places in Yorkshire, a beautiful part of the country where stunning coastlines, historic buildings, and sometimes desolate landscapes lend themselves well to a fertile imagination and the possibilities of spooky goings-on. Get comfortable, grab a little something to sip on, perhaps cuddle up under a blanket to help offset the chills coming your way, and let's dive into the story. Dedicated to my wonderful daughter Emily, on her 27th birthday. Gather round, everyone, gather round. The night is cold and the bonfire will cool soon. See how the flames are already dying to reveal devil-red embers peering furtively through the cracks of the charred and broken logs. There is a long tradition on All Hallows' Eve of telling stories full of mystery and suspense, with jumps and starts to delight even the most serious of listeners. In good spirits, I have listened to your tales of ghouls and monsters, murderous convicts, and vicious beasts. You have built a gory path, constructed by your own blood and fertile imaginations, to lead us into All Hallows' Day. Tomorrow, the dead will be remembered, but tonight we feast upon fear and fantasy. Hurry up there and secure your place by the fire, for now it is my turn. I warn you, however, in advance that the tale I will recount has no element of fantasy whatsoever. The events I shall put before you are true in their entirety, and I know this as fact, because they happened to me, although I wish with all my might that they hadn't. Even now, some 2 decades later, the weight of those days hangs from my shoulders like a heavy cape, dragging me down towards the depths of hell. But worry not if you falter during my tale. You are safe, and the heat of the embers will warm your chilled soul. So wrap your blankets around your shoulders, my friends, to prevent the demons in the darkness behind you from tickling your neck with their ice-cold breath. And if we are all settled, I will begin. I was in London when the letter reached me. A brusque knock notified me that my landlady, Mrs. Wilson, was outside my room, and when I opened the paint-chip door, she handed me a slightly crumpled white envelope, with her usual efficiency, and then turned and began her descent of the stairs. I had been at her establishment for the last 3 months as I looked to arrange meetings with prospective employers, and whilst my room in a previous era would doubtless have housed a maid, it was comfortably furnished and met my current needs. I moved to the bed and sat down as I opened the envelope. I pulled out the contents and started reading. Dear Sir, it is our unfortunate duty to inform you of the impending death of Mr. Edgar Frederick Morgan of Bleakmore House in the North Riding of Yorkshire. Mr. Morgan has been ill for some time, and his condition is now deteriorating quite rapidly. We are entering into correspondence with you because we believe you to be a relative of Mr. Morgan on your mother's side. Indeed, we believe you to be Mr. Morgan's closest surviving relative, if not the only one. Mr. Morgan has expressed a strong desire that he is paid a visit by you before he passes, so that he can share with you some family history. We would therefore like to meet with you at your earliest convenience to make arrangements. Yours sincerely, Arthur H. Douglas, Solicitor. I read the letter 2 times more as I attempted to digest its content and meaning. The name of Edgar Morgan was not known to me, nor was Bleakmore House. I racked my brains over and over, but not even the slightest spark of recognition would come. The link to my mother was intriguing, but alas, I would be unable to ask her. She was taken some 3 years ago now, and my father 2 years before that. My mother was an only child. She spoke often of her childhood and youth, and how she met my father when he came to work for hers. But of aunts, uncles, cousins, and the like, there was no mention. Her maiden name was Griffiths, so how she may have been related to Mr. Morgan, I didn't know. My father was the eldest of 3 sons, but his 2 younger siblings had died young and unmarried, heroes and victims simultaneously in the great fight for freedom. There was only one way to resolve the mystery, and that was to suspend my current search for employment and travel to North Yorkshire to meet with Mr. Douglas. Mrs. Wilson was kind enough to allow me to use her telephone, and arrangements were made. I paid her until the end of the week, then travelled to the station with my suitcase and a growing sense of adventure. From the tone of the letter, I was starting to think that something was coming my way. How right I was, but how could I ever have imagined the true nature of what it might be? I made it to King's Cross in good time and purchased my ticket. The concourse was busy, but not excessively so, and I navigated my way through the people to my platform. I boarded the train and walked along the corridor until I found an empty compartment, lifted my suitcase onto the overhead rack, and settled myself into a seat by the window. I must have dozed off as the train chugged steadily out of the station, because I awoke with a start as the train, now travelling at quite a speed, went through a tunnel. Someone had opened the window a little, and the rattle of the train on the tracks bounced off the brickwork of the tunnel and into the compartment with deafening effect. Composing myself and glancing around the compartment, I now noticed 2 others had joined me. In the far seat by the corridor window was a young woman, dressed smartly in a tweed suit and reading a volume of poetry. Directly opposite me sat a man, engrossed in, and almost entirely obscured by, the Times. I settled into my seat. and watched the countryside roll by. 30 minutes later we stopped at our destination, and the young woman alighted. The gentleman opposite me folded his newspaper, and I was able to see him properly for the first time. I was surprised to see that he was wearing a dog collar. He must have registered my sudden awareness of his profession, for he smiled and held out his hand. "Reverend Percival Kenaway, pleased to meet you. Are you travelling far?" I shook his hand, returned my name, and gave my destination. "Well, that is a coincidence," he exclaimed. "We appear to be going to the same place. I'm the vicar of St. Mary's, so do feel free to attend my church at any time during your stay." He was an amicable fellow with a big smile. No fire and brimstone in his sermons, I imagined. We struck up an easy conversation, and time started to pass quite quickly. From him I learned that our mutual destination was a small market town, and that he had been the vicar of St. Mary's for 4 years. He described the town, its inhabitants and facilities with great warmth, and I started to look forward to our arrival. Next, he asked me about my reason for travel. I explained that I had received a letter from Mr. Douglas, and was greatly relieved when he knew and vouched for the fellow. He confessed to managing some of his own affairs through the firm Douglas and Biddle. Indeed, Mr. Douglas was a regular attendee at church. "Watch out, though, when you visit," Kenaway grinned. "The word in Sunday school amongst some of our younger and more imaginative parishioners is that the firm's offices are haunted." "Haunted?" I responded with happy surprise. "Surely not. I'm not sure I'm a true believer. In ghosts, that is. What about you, Reverend Kenaway? Do you believe in such things?" He grinned again. "I certainly believe in the Holy Ghost," he replied, "but as for the fearful apparitions said to frequent Douglas and Biddle, I'm not so sure." He told me the tale, quite a basic one and typical of schoolyard imagination. The facts were that Samuel Biddle, the grandfather of the firm's current partner, was working on the affairs of a local man. Apparently one night he was working late. Upon finishing for the evening, he took his candle and started to descend the stairs, but tripped over a loose thread and fell to his death. Childish over-imagination suggested, however, was that whilst working late, he discovered a secret hidden in his client's affairs and sent for the gentleman. After a brief discussion, an argument broke out, and as Biddle tried to leave, he was pushed to his death, and the files were removed. He was found the following morning by his son, an apprentice at the time, on opening up for the day. Either way, he continued, his unfortunate life did end prematurely. He was a mere 46 at the time of his death. He's buried in the grounds of St. Mary's. Mysterious business affairs, murder and phantoms. Small as the town was, I fancied it a lively place. We continued our conversation for the duration of the journey, albeit on a less fanciful basis, and when we arrived at the small station, he pointed me in the direction of the town centre, bid me farewell, and went on his way. I was directed by the receptionist into the waiting room of Douglas and Biddle, and I chose a chair opposite the large bay window, where I could see both the high street outside and the old wooden staircase within. I remembered the ghost story recounted by Reverend Kenaway, and my gaze then settled upon an old photograph, perhaps dating back some 40 or so years. I arose and went to inspect it further. The picture, faded sepia behind a glass cover in an old wooden frame, depicted 4 men. Each was suited and wearing what would now be considered a rather old-fashioned hat. They stood in front of an old stone building with freshly painted doors and windows and a sign announcing their arrival as a business. The card mount surrounding the photograph was printed with each of their names: Edward Cartwright, Arthur F. Douglas, Joshua Appleby, and Samuel Biddle. So there he was, Samuel Biddle, the would-be haunter of these premises. I peered closer to view him in more detail. Samuel Biddle was a dour gentleman with a head of neatly combed black hair and groomed side whiskers. He was tall and slender. His face was unsmiling and angular, with prominent cheekbones. Thick, black eyebrows rested above small but focused eyes. He was of reasonable age in the photograph, perhaps 39 or 40. So engrossed was I in my inspection that I didn't hear the approaching footsteps, and when my name was called, I swung round with a guilty air, like a child trying to conceal a stolen toffee. "Arthur Douglas," he said, offering his hand. I took it. "Thank you so much for making such a journey at short notice. I do hope it wasn't too inconvenient, but exceptional circumstances must prevail. I see you're looking at our founding partners. That's my grandfather, second from the left, Arthur F. Douglas. The gentleman on the end is the father of old Mr. Biddle, who also still works part of the week. A very sad business. He was a relatively young man and died right here in the building." I nodded and said that I had heard as much. "Oh," he smiled. "I think you mean you've been told the story of our fictional ghost. Not a word is true, of course. No evidence of foul play, missing files, or mystery clients at all. Just a very unfortunate accident. Come, let's go to my office and talk some more about your situation." I followed him up the wooden stairs and into a large room off the first-floor corridor. It was exactly as I had imagined. It reeked of age and old papers, and every part was crammed with some legal term or other. There was a small fire burning, and over the fireplace hung another historical photograph, possibly of the High Street, although I couldn't be certain. A clock ticked loudly on the wall, and two mismatched but well-made upholstered chairs sat in front of the desk. He ushered me into one, and then walked around his desk and seated himself. The desk itself had several books and documents piled on it, but one file had already been selected and placed in front of him on the blotter. It bore the title, Edgar Frederick Morgan, Bleakmore House. I spoke first. "Mr. Douglas," I began, "I have thought long and hard regarding the potential relationship between my mother and your Mr. Morgan, and I'm convinced there has been some kind of mistake. Her maiden name was Griffiths, you see, and she was an only child, so I can't see how there could be any link at all." Mr. Douglas, who had placed some gold-rimmed spectacles onto his nose, now peered over the top of the frames at me. "My dear fellow," he said with an air of authoritative concern, "I can see now that you are not fully appraised of your family history, and I'm afraid that what I may tell you may come as a bit of a shock." I was not expecting this. Not appraised of my own family history. Whatever could he mean? He waited a moment for me to absorb this news, and then continued. "Your mother was indeed raised a Griffiths. However, your grandmother, Mrs. Lillian Griffiths, was married twice. First to Mr. Thomas Morgan, and later to the man you knew as your grandfather. It was during her first marriage to Thomas Morgan that a daughter was born. Your mother." But why? But how?" I spluttered, hardly able to comprehend what he was saying, my head racing with so many thoughts and questions. "It's very possible," he continued, "that your mother remained unaware of this. Your grandmother's first marriage ended just 2 months after your mother's birth, when Thomas Morgan died following a brief illness. She then married your grandfather and became Griffiths some 6 months later. It would have been very hard for her financially to have brought up her daughter alone, and Mr. Griffiths appeared to have been willing to take on your mother as his own child and offer them both security and a future. At the point when your grandmother married him, your mother could have been no more than 8 or 9 months old. They moved away, and to the rest of the world they would appear just like any other family. Father, mother, and child." "But this is the first I've heard any of it," I said. "How do you know this to be true? What proof do you have?" Mr. Douglas was a wise man. He had foreseen my possible distress and had all the information he required to assure me that his version of events was correct. He continued calmly and with an empathetic tone. "When word came that Mr. Edgar Morgan of Bleakmore House wished us to look for relatives, we did a thorough search. He had only one brother, 2 years younger, the late Thomas Morgan. Edgar himself did marry, but sadly his wife died tragically young, and there was no issue from this marriage." He paused again for me to catch up, and then continued. We then had to look at his closest relative, in this case Thomas. Church records at St Mary's clearly document Thomas's marriage to your grandmother Lillian, and then the baptism of your mother. This means that Edgar Morgan is your mother's uncle on her father's side. This also means that he is your great-uncle, and that you are his only surviving relative. It also means, he continued slowly, that you are the sole heir to his estate, including Bleakmore House, its grounds, and chattels. I understand that today's revelations have come as a shock to you, and I understand why Mr. Morgan wishes to see you and explain the family history himself before he departs this world. I was stunned. Images of family passed through my mind. Everything I had known as truth was now a little blurred, and I felt like a ship, sitting listlessly on a calm and breezeless ocean, the wind having been taken completely out of my sails. Had my mother known her family history? I could only assume she did not. All those times I had spent with the man I knew as my grandfather, only to find out now that someone else with the legitimate right to that title had come before him. What had he been like? What had happened to him? I needed to know, and fortunately, Mr. Edgar Morgan would be able to tell me. We paused for a cup of tea and a welcome piece of fruitcake before continuing. Mr. Douglas suggested brandy, but I feared I needed to remain alert to absorb and process what I had learned. After the refreshments, we continued our discussion, focusing this time on Bleakmore and the arrangements that had been made for my journey there following the meeting. Of Mr. Edgar Morgan, Mr. Douglas knew very little. He determined him to be in his mid-80s, but he had lived as reclusive a life as possible following his wife's death. She was believed to have been younger than him and had come from the town, although following the marriage he took her back to Bleakmore, and she was rarely seen in the town after that point, Bleakmore being several miles east of the coast. Of Bleakmore House and grounds, Mr. Douglas had a little more information. He had a couple of photographs in the file before him, which he now opened, and I found myself looking at a large, handsome house and gardens, which led to a high, white cliff overlooking the sea. It couldn't have been a more stunning location, and I was barely listening to Mr. Douglas as he went through particulars of this beautiful property that I was now sole heir to inherit. I was entranced. As our meeting neared conclusion, my travel arrangements were laid out for me. I was to be driven over to Bleakmore that afternoon. My arrival was expected by Mr. Morgan, and his maid Violet and Mr. Douglas would be in touch at a later date. We shook hands, and he led me out of the office and downstairs. As we went to find my coat, I heard a creak on the landing above me and glanced up. There, stood by the banister and staring down at me with an intensity I found hard to bear, was a man, smartly dressed, with thick black hair and black side whiskers. What I noticed most were his angular features and prominent cheekbones. I stood there, frozen to the spot, and meeting his cold stare for what seemed like an eternity before I was finally able to tear my eyes away, and when I glanced back, only several seconds later, he had gone. Mr. Douglas came back with my coat. "If you need anything, you know how to get word to me," he said. "And you already know the Reverend Kennaway, so that's another acquaintance you can call upon should you require assistance. I bid you good day, sir." I stepped out of the office with my coat and suitcase and walked over to the gentleman parked nearby that had kindly agreed to drive me to Bleakmore. Mr. Douglas was correct in that I now knew two people who I could turn to in the town, but in my chilled heart I was absolutely certain that I had just met a third, Mr. Samuel Biddle, at the very spot where he had met his untimely death. The drive to Bleakmore was a pleasant one, and my companion was affable, but not overly so. As we drove along winding lanes and over desolate, heather-strewn moors, he pointed out hidden villages and gave the names of local landowners and farmers that I resolved to remember and then promptly forgot. Hidden amongst the hardy purple heather and rampant green ferns were sheep, apparently wandering at leisure, their long, uncut tails swinging as they trotted away from the car. It was a stunning landscape, forged over time and largely untamed by man. The car whirred and spluttered as my companion attempted to slow our descent down impossibly steep hills and keep the car going on the climbs up the other side. Presently we came to a turning into a lane that appeared to lead to a private property. At the entrance just off the road there was a tall, rusting metal gate, and beside it, on a stone wall, was a plaque announcing our arrival at Bleakmore House. "This is where I'll leave you," my companion said. "The driveway leading to Bleakmore is rather ancient, or so I've heard. Not at all suitable for modern vehicles. Shouldn't be too long a walk, though. About half a mile, I should think." I thanked him for his kind assistance, took my coat and suitcase, and set off down the old cinder-track road. The entrance to the property and first part of my walk took me through a small woodland of pine trees, their scent strong and refreshing in the light breeze. Then the road turned, and before me lay a magnificent white building, just as I had seen in the photos, and a short distance beyond that, across a wide and well-maintained lawn, was the sea. I gasped. This truly appeared to be a hidden paradise. With a renewed vigour, I walked on to meet my great-uncle. As I approached the house, its character and charm remained, although on closer inspection it was clear that some areas required a little maintenance. Nothing much, but perhaps indicative of an elderly owner who no longer had the strength or desire to walk round his estate, addressing areas of minor repair. I made my way to the large wooden front door and pulled the handle for the bell. A minute or so later, I heard scurrying footsteps. A pause, no doubt as clothing was straightened and hair smoothed, and the door was opened to greet me. The person on the other side was a young woman, perhaps 19 or 20, in a small black dress cut to the calf, with a crisp white apron, white collar, and cuffs, and a small white cap. "Violet, I presume?" I asked, and proceeded to introduce myself. "I believe you're expecting me." "Yes, sir," she replied, and took my coat. I retained my suitcase for the time being, as I understood from Mr. Douglas that she was the last remaining servant of Bleakmore, and I felt it unfair to ask her to carry my case to my room. She took me through to a sitting room with comfortable chairs, a stone fireplace, and told me that she would return presently with some tea. In fact, she returned not only with tea, but also with a thickly cut and generously salted beef sandwich, for which I was very grateful. She left me to eat them and relax after my journey, and said that she would return in half an hour to show me to my room. I ate my sandwich, drank the tea, and settled back into my armchair gratefully. I do not want you to think in any way that I am narcoleptic, but for the second time that day I fell asleep, the sound of gulls and nearby waves echoing in my ear. When I next opened my eyes, the room was a shade darker, and Violet was waiting patiently by the door. I apologized for leaving her waiting, although in truth I felt much better for having slept a while. I asked her to show me to my room, and then asked when I might be able to meet and talk to my great-uncle for a while. "Oh, sir," she exclaimed, wide-eyed with concern. "I sent word to Mr. Douglas this afternoon about Mr. Morgan's condition. He must not have got the message before your meeting. He's not dead, is he?" I asked. "No, sir," she replied a little calmer. "Although he has taken a turn for the worst, I'm afraid. The doctor says it will be a matter of days now, and Mr. Morgan will most likely spend the last of his time with us asleep. He's also receiving treatment to null any pain he might feel and keep him comfortable. I'm sorry to inform you that he's most unlikely to be able to converse with you at all." What a day! I had both gained and now stood to lose a great-uncle within the space of a few hours. The feeling of exhaustion passed over me again. I asked Violet to take me to my room so that I could unpack, and then take me to him so that I could sit with him for a while. I followed her through the hall and up the wide wooden staircase to the first floor, where she directed me to a room of excellent proportions with a double bed, a lit fire, and a direct view to the cliffs and the sea beyond. I asked her to leave me for an hour whilst I unpacked and changed, and then to escort me to my great-uncle's room so I could sit with him a while. He might not be able to answer me, but perhaps he would hear me and feel some peace that someone was sitting with him in his final days. Once ready, I settled into a comfortably upholstered wing-back chair in front of the window and gazed out towards the sea to wait until Violet returned. The gardens now appeared a little less well-maintained than I had previously thought, but were no less beautiful because of it. A stone pathway, which appeared to lead from a large set of French windows beneath my room and to the left, took my gaze and carried it towards the high chalk cliff. On either side of the pathway was a rectangular lawn, each framed with plantings and shrubs, and at regular intervals were stone statues, alternate lions and orbs, mounted on ornamental stone plinths, each lawn's decoration mirroring the other. And despite the grass being an inch or so higher than what might be desirable, the overall effect was perfectly thought through and executed. I sat in full contentment for a while, watching the gulls surf the air pockets, and even managed to open the sash window a little to hear their screeches. The sea beyond, which appeared to be touching the cliffs below, was a shimmering blue, as calm as a mill pond and glittering in the last fleeting remnants of sunlight. It seemed like only moments before Violet returned to lead me into further unknown areas of this wonderful house. We walked down a wide, darkened corridor with alcoves and paintings at regular intervals to rooms at the other side of the house. On the way, she pointed out the bathroom, which was happily close to my own room, and she soon paused by a large wooden door, opened a little and illuminated in the early evening shadow by the embers of the fire. She handed me a lit candle in an old-fashioned holder to provide a little extra light. She also advised that she would be leaving her duties for the evening shortly, and that if I could make my way to the dining room after my visit, she would leave out some supper and a glass of wine for me. I thanked her and entered the room. It was a very large room, although arranged differently to my own. On the wall to my right was a well-proportioned fireplace, sufficient to heat the room. Opposite the door was a large window, this time overlooking orchards to the side of the house. To the left of the door, the room extended back into an extensive windowless area where a double bed and other furnishings were placed. The bed was already in deep shadow, and I had to walk several steps closer into the unlit gloom to reach it. Laying in the centre, wrapped in sheets and bedding, was a very elderly man, paper-skinned and raw-boned as only the dying can be. He lay in deep sleep, breathing steadily, his face so reposed that all lines and wrinkles he once may have acquired on his long journey through life appeared melted away. By his bed was a chair, and I sat on it, not sure where to begin. I gave him my name. I apologized for not knowing to come earlier or even of his existence as my relative. I told him details of the life I had led to date and what I hoped to achieve in the future. I told him about the full life my grandmother had lived, and that sadly perhaps even my mother had not been told about her real father, his brother. Once the talking started, it became easier and then flowed. I told him about my school days and where I grew up. I even told him about my childhood pets and favourite pastimes. When at last I ran out of steam, I smoothed his bed covers and sat back in my chair, the room now being in almost complete darkness, save for the dying embers and my flickering candlelight. My attention was suddenly sharpened by a shuffling in the far corner to the right of the bedroom. I screwed my eyes into the darkness and, "Oh my God!" I leapt to my feet, knocking the chair sideways and almost stumbling to the floor. I tried to speak again, but during that terrible moment total horror had sucked every last pocket of air from my lungs. For a second I thought my heart would never beat again, for in the darkened corner of the room, in deep shadows, sat a figure, silent and watching me, unnerved by my shock and maintaining a direct and oppressive stare. I regained my composure and saw that the figure was a woman, small of height judging from her position in the chair in which she sat, but of generous build and not far distant in age to my great-uncle. My eyes now reaching more confidently into the shadows, I noted that she wore a long dress in the old style and that her hair was grey and frayed, secured on her head in a knot. "Madam, what in God's name do you think you're doing? Listening in on a private conversation between a man and his ailing relative? Why did you not make your presence known to me? What is your business?" She retained her gaze. "My sincere apologies, sir," she responded in a calm and even tone. Did I detect the lightest hint of sarcasm and disdain in her voice? "I fear I must have fallen asleep in the discharge of my duties. I am Mrs. Armitstead. I was a midwife by profession, and now I wait with the sick and dying. I'm here to watch over your great-uncle in his final hours and help him transition into what lies beyond." She rose and moved almost silently to the side of the bed, save for the soft rustle of her long skirts and the merest creak of a floorboard. "Then I thank you, madam," I replied, feeling a little more composed. "It must be a comfort to him knowing that you are by his bedside." "I cannot answer for him in that matter," she responded. "All I can do is watch over him during these last few days and hours and ensure that he meets his fate in the way he deserves." The candle illuminated her ancient features, furrows of lined shadow contrasting with flickering highlights picked out by the light. At that moment, my great-uncle's sleep became more fitful, and his eyes, grey and rheumy, opened wide and fixed upon Mrs. Armitstead's face. But if there was any comfort to be derived by her presence, he didn't disclose it. His face contorted into a hideous grimace, whether through pain or fear I cannot say, and he let out a high-pitched scream before sinking back into his pillows and returning to sleep. The candle flickered wildly and went out. After the evening's events, I was pleased to make my way downstairs and locate the dining room. I was famished and pleased to see that Violet had indeed left some provisions out for me. I poured myself a glass of wine and then feasted on cold chicken, a hunk of cheese, tomatoes, celery, and grapes, and a generous piece of crusty bread. Simple as it was, I can honestly say it was a delicious meal. I sat a while and then made my way back to my allocated bedroom. I was feeling more comfortable with the basic layout of the house and was able to return to the bathroom I had passed earlier, and then I returned and donned my pyjamas. I had no reading materials, and the meal had made me sleepy, so I closed the curtains and climbed into bed for a good night's rest. So luxurious was it that I hardly had time to extinguish the light before I fell asleep. I first woke at 11 p.m. A grandfather clock in the corridor outside my room imprinted the hour into my fumbling brain before I even realized where I was. Seconds later my sleep returned, and I drifted back to oblivion. The second time I woke to the echo of loud taps in the air. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in quick succession. I exited the bed and lit the candle as quickly as I could, asking the visitor to wait as I made my way to the door. I pulled on my dressing gown and opened the door, fully expecting to see Violet or Mrs. Armitstead. There was no one there. The dark corridor was empty, save for the grandfather clock and the shadows dancing in the light of my candle. I fancied the exertions of my full day and the generous bit of cheese had pushed my sleeping mind into the realms of dreams, and that what I'd heard was in fact the remnants of another story, now forgotten, that had played out in my head. I climbed back into bed and went back to sleep. The third time I woke, I crawled out of the depths of slumber gradually, awareness building as I went. At first, I hovered between the two states, confused and befuddled. I could hear something distant, humming. As I crept towards consciousness, I began to recognize the sounds of voices, and on full awakening, I realized I was listening in to the rumblings of an argument somewhere in the depths of the house. I lay for a few moments and waited for the muffled dispute to desist, But there was no easing of the quarrel. And with every to and fro of the heated discussion, it became impossible to ignore it and block it out. This was unforgivable. I didn't recognize the voices. Who were these two infernal individuals intent on breaking the still of the night in the house of a dying man? I had to put a stop to this before Violet, Mrs. Armistead, and my great-uncle were all similarly affected. I again crawled from my bed and lit the candle. With dressing gown and slippers on, I crept from my room. I carefully made my way down the wide staircase and into the hall. The shouting was a little louder now, and although the words escaped me, the voices were clearly those of a man in a heightened state of anger and a woman in some distress. They came to me from a corridor to my right, leading from behind the stairs and away from the main rooms to a far less decorated area of the house beyond. I followed them slowly, the inadequate candlelight leading my way. At the end of the corridor, I came to a closed wooden door of large proportions and paused outside. The voices were much louder now, but the words remained indistinct. I stumbled over what to do next. So intent had I been in following the voices that I had failed to come up with a plan. But as the man continued to rage and the woman continued in her distress, I knew I would need to confront them and put a stop to the altercation. There was nothing more to do other than swing the door open widely and demand to know what was going on. I turned the knob and pushed the door open with force in an attempt to stop the shouting and focus the attention of both parties on myself. The room beyond was empty. Silver rays of moonlight fell silently through the panes of a Georgian window onto a large pine table. The blue shadows of night lay across the ovens, fireplace and sink, and stillness reigned supreme. Of the people, there was no sign. I stood alone on the threshold, unable to move, my nervous eyes taking in the noiseless pall of the room, my heart beating faster in my chest. I backed slowly away, the door still open, and returned to my bedroom. Of what had happened, I had no explanation. Indeed, even now, I was starting to question what I had actually heard. Weary and confused, I climbed back into bed and blew out the candle. The weight and comfort of the blankets engulfed me, and I fell into a deep and dreamless sleep. For the remainder of the night I slept well and was surprised when I woke the next morning to see sunshine creeping around the edges of my curtains, bleeding light into the room. I got out of bed, dressed, and opened the curtains. I had no idea of the time, but the weather outside was glorious. The lawns were green and lush, and the sun shimmered on the gentle swell of the waves. By now, I had almost convinced myself that the events of last night were nothing more than nightmares, and I fancied that a walk along the cliffs would clear my head and reinvigorate me. There was no sign of Violet as I descended the stairs, but as I passed the dining room, I saw coffee, toast, and eggs laid out. She must have heard me stirring in my bedroom. I ate thankfully and then found the room with the French windows. They opened easily onto a small stone patio. I was descending the 3 steps onto the path when my eye was drawn to a glinting in the lawn border to my left. I bent down and picked up the object, brushing away soil and expecting to see a fragment of aging glass, but instead I found myself looking at a beautifully crafted marble. It was slightly larger than average size and would have been a prized possession of any child. The swirls of colour intertwined within it were mesmerizing, and I held it up to the sun and admired its beauty. I slipped it into my pocket and carried on down the path to the cliff top. I chose to walk along the trail to my left. The glorious sunshine and uplifting breeze raised my spirits. I spent a wonderful couple of hours strolling along, feasting my eyes on the glorious expanse of shimmering blue and listening to the screeches of gulls overhead. I watched in awe as they dived into the salt water and returned with their prize. As I turned, Bleakmore House was a spot in the distance, inching closer with every step. It stood remote and resolute, commanding the vast expanse of land between moor and sea, alone in its task, with no neighbours or interruptions, save for the odd sheep or two who strayed occasionally from the heather to gorge on the salt-lit grasslands by the sea. I allowed myself to think for a moment what the outcome of my meeting with Mr. Douglas might be. Would I really inherit this house and the land around? It seemed unbelievable that only a few days ago I had been walking through the smog-filled streets of London, drowning in the urgency and bustle of everyday life. And now I walked in a secluded and dazzling paradise with the prospect of making it my own. Of course, I was sorry that Edgar Morgan and I would never properly meet, and that my future at Bleakmore could only be secured by his demise. But at the same time, there was a joy in my heart on that coastal path, surrounded by nature and life, and a peace in my soul that I had never before felt. That brings us to the end of this episode. We truly hope you enjoyed the first part of this atmospheric story. Stay tuned next week for the second and final part of this fantastic story by Emma Hudairi. If you have an original story that would send a chill down our spines and you would like to submit it for review, simply send it in to hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. That's hauntedukfiction@hotmail.com. Until next time, stay safe and take care.